George Bizos has been described as a champion of the oppressed and a fearless fighter for social justice. Bizos, who died recently at the age of 92, was laid to rest at an official funeral today. He's known around the world for his anti-apartheid activism, and notably as a human rights lawyer, he represented Nelson Mandela at the Rivonia trial. His legal career involved fighting for justice for the families of Steve Biko and Ahmed Timol, and opposing Chris Hani's killers at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. To discuss his impact on the legal fraternity now and his legacy, we're joined by senior advocate at the Johannesburg Bar, Tembeka Ngcukaitobi, who spent time with Bizos at the Legal Resources Centre. Advocate, it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much. So as a younger lawyer with a clear interest in human rights, how inspirational was George Bizos?
Very inspirational and also aspirational. We as young lawyers, when I was still a young lawyer, did not have many examples as role models for human rights law, the law that we wanted to practice. The person who embodies the aspirations and inspiration of being a human rights lawyer. And no one did that more than George Bizos. Unlike many lawyers of his generation who transitioned to the bench and became judges, Bizos remained a practitioner virtually until the end of his life. He never left the bar. And unlike some of the lawyers of his era who also transitioned sideways and embarked upon other vocations and careers, Bizos remained at the Legal Resources Centre, which was the primary human rights organization in the 70s and in the 80s, and it still is one of the stronger human rights organizations. So both his decision to remain in practice as a lawyer and his decision to apply his trade at a human rights organization were very inspirational decisions. And so as someone who embodied the ethos, the practice and the vision of human rights law, Bizos was something to be admired, someone to be looked up to, and someone to teach one the art and the practice of human rights litigation.
And he was there for 25 years, we understand. So like you say, embodying sort of that selfless service. And you also wrote recently about him, calling him a kind man. So just in those everyday interactions, tell us what you noticed.
Yes, I mean, George, well, we called him George. George was a total human being in the sense that the human rights that he exhibited in court, in law, at the office, was the human rights that he also lived. The segmentation that most of us have between our lives privately and our lives publicly was not something that George Bizos exhibited. So the totality of his humanness transcended his professional life. And because we worked with him, we also learned not just how to be better lawyers, but how to be human beings, how to be better human beings. There are many examples that I can think about in relation to lessons in life. When we engaged in legal practice, George always placed at the center of each case the interest of the client. He never sought to place the interest of the lawyer ahead of the interest of his client. George at home always thought carefully about his spouse, about his children. And George also thought about people beyond his family, thinking about how their lives could be improved. There are examples, it's just that I'm on national television and one does not want to mention names of people that may not have been contacted.
Yeah.
But when I was at the Legal Resources Centre, I could give you examples of young children, of members of staff that he paid university fees for, of people of staff that he assisted to get better jobs. So it's this transcendence of the human rights from practice to life itself. And that is why he was a large human being. He had a large heart, a very generous spirit, And this is where I say that he, in many respects, represented a generation that has departed, a dying generation, which just did not practice human rights law, but lived the spirit that animates human rights. So he put the idea of human in human rights.
Yeah. And I encountered that humanness. I interviewed him after the death of Madiba, and I think lots of people will remember he openly wept. And I'd like to ask you, looking back at that history, he was talking about advising Nelson Mandela at the Rivonia trial not to use those words, that I would die. But Madiba went ahead. But beautiful stories. Do we have that all written down? Do we have that history recorded? And you've written a piece recently saying this is how Bizos would want us to remember him, focusing on that anti-apartheid era.
Yes, fortunately with George, he wrote 3 books. The first book was a recorder of a lot of cases that he did in the context of criminal inquests. Stories of the Craddock Four, stories of Steve Biko, stories of Luxmat Gudle, stories of Ahmed Timol, stories of cases that he personally litigated. And the title of that book was No One to Blame. The most fascinating story about that title itself. And I actually asked, in fact, I didn't ask George, he volunteered the information in the context of a trip that him and I undertook to Marikana, which I wrote about recently. That phrase, no one to blame, actually came from Nontsikelelo Biko, the widow of Steve Biko, when she heard the outcome of the Biko inquest, and the magistrate found that although the evidence overwhelmingly showed that Steve Biko was murdered in the course of his detention, but the magistrate nevertheless found that there was no one liable. So apparently, according to George, Ntsiki Biko exclaimed, "What? No one to blame?" And so he took that title and put it in his book. There were many other stories that Bizos regaled us about. And mainly, these are stories illustrating the way in which the apartheid judiciary functioned, which constantly exculpated, excused, and avoided responsibility on the part of the officials, whether it was the police, the security branch, or it was the soldiers. And there are many stories as well of the legal profession. George Bizos was almost a sort of a pariah among some of his colleagues. The choices that the legal profession made during his era as an advocate, it was not always fashionable. I mean, the one example I remember about, it was not always fashionable. He mentioned the example how it was difficult to get legal representation for someone like Nelson Mandela, who in the 60s was regarded as a terrorist. And regarding him as a terrorist was not just something associated only with the government. There were many, many white people in this country who, in fact, also believed that he was a terrorist, and many advocates as well who wouldn't touch Nelson Mandela. I remember George mentioning the story about how difficult it was, people like him, people like Arthur Charles Kelsey, who ultimately took Nelson Mandela's case.
Yeah.
George wrote another book subsequent to No One to Blame, which is basically his life story. It is a 900-page tome where he records the story of his arrival in South Africa as an immigrant, a Greek immigrant, not being able to speak a word of English. In fact, he was a refugee, not even being able to speak a word of English at the age of 8 or 9. And how over time, and this is where his humanity shines through, how over time what spoke for him most powerfully and gained him acceptability in the South African context was his skin color. So although he was an immigrant, although he was Greek, although he was a foreigner, he became acceptable and enjoyed the privileges of the country, because at the time they were growing up, apartheid was consolidating and the color bar was getting stronger. And so George was willing to accept the reality that most white people almost deny in this country, that actually white privilege was a real thing under apartheid. And lastly, George wrote another book, a shorter book called 65 Years of Friendship. That was a book recording his relationship with Nelson Mandela. And that relationship basically starts in the 40s when they were both law students at Wits University. I actually interviewed George when he launched 65 Years with Mandela in Cape Town. I had the privilege of being invited to interview him. It's a most fascinating book to read, but it is also a very kind book. And that is where his personality, his friendship, his strength of character, his big heart shines through. Because although both of them were strong men, I mean, Nelson Mandela was a strong man in his youth. He was a strong man also even after he came out of prison. And George was also a strong man. Although both of them had strong personalities, but there were softer sides to both of them. And that book, 65 Years of Freedom, also tries to explore the sort of softer edges, the softer sides to both of them.
Yeah.
So in one respect, some stories are told. But I always felt, Francis, that there is a lot that is yet to be told, despite the fact that George has probably written more than 1,500 pages of his life. And one of them was the story I told in one of the articles I wrote, which is, that trip to Marikana and his experiences, perspectives, and views about the post-liberation era. George spent most of his life fighting against apartheid. And when freedom came, he was almost at the twilight of his years. And that the stories of disappointment, really, the stories of the sense that this is not what we fought for. And I feel that a lot of those stories of all of the people that fought for freedom have not yet been recorded. Well, maybe you may ask me, well, why am I not recording them? Well, one day.
I think people would appreciate that. And I mean, I was going to ask you that. If there's still justice outstanding, he was devastated, you say, by Marikana. Is that something we should be ashamed of as a country if we say that George Bizos is our moral compass? And I guess in a way, his death has sparked some introspection about the rule of law in South Africa, what it should mean, and maybe what it hasn't meant at times over many years.
Yes, we should be, to answer the question directly, we should be ashamed that Marikana happened. George was ashamed that it happened. And what ashamed him about the fact that it happened was that it actually represented everything that he fought against. And the one story he mentioned was Sharpeville. And particularly about Sharpeville, the fact that the police went to the commission, because there was a commission of inquiry after Sharpeville. The police went to the commission to give evidence. And they claimed, cop after cop, that they acted in self-defense. The evidence was that the vast majority of those that were killed in Sharpeville had been shot from the back. In Marikana, the police went to give evidence. They claimed that they were acting in self-defense. Almost 98% of those that were shot had been shot from the back. So it clearly illustrates that although there is, of course, a manifest distinction between the democratic era and the apartheid era, there are some continuities. So the transformation of the security establishment is something that is urgent. I have had occasion myself to do cases during the lockdown of naked police brutality. So that's the one area. The other area that distressed George was the area of socio-economic transformation. Remember that our constitution is unique. I won't say special or best, but it is at least unique because it contains a comprehensive section in the Bill of Rights that makes socio-economic rights judicially enforceable. So under the law, we are all entitled to adequate housing. Under the law, we are all entitled to water. We are entitled to food. We are entitled not to be hungry. But George was distressed that all of those aspirations have in fact not been realized. Of course, he never expected that this would be done overnight. But I think what did distress him was that instead of moving towards a more inclusive society, the post-apartheid order had actually moved towards a more disparate society. By any measure today, South Africa is among the most unequal in the world, which means that we are straying away from the vision of the Constitution to create a more adequate society. And the third thing that did distress him was the tendency to criticize the Constitution for the failures of the post-apartheid legal order. And for the most part, he felt that the Constitution sets a vision, it sets an aspiration, it sets a standard. and that the failures, the political failures, the economic failures, there was a general tendency in society to criticize or blame the Constitution. In fact, I think in his book, Odyssey to Freedom, which is the life story or the autobiography, he has a section towards the end there that addresses the very question of land, almost in a prophetic way. I mean, never knew that land would become such a topical issue, but in a prophetic way addresses the question of land, and then addresses the question about how the Constitution, particularly Section 25, was intended as a platform for radical socio-economic change. But the system is broken, and therefore it makes it impossible for us to work towards the realization of the objects of the Constitution. So in many respects, although he was pleased that apartheid as a legal system, as a political system, as an economic system, had been removed from the statute.
All right, we have to leave it there, but thank you so much. I mean, leaving us so much to reflect upon as a nation. Our condolences to you, and no doubt you will continue to carry on that work, taking on the side of the oppressed. Thank you so much for your time tonight. That was Advocate Tembeka Ngcukaitobi.